In November 2007, Amazon launched a product it called the Kindle. The company's servers went down within hours. The device sold out in 5.5 hours and stayed out of stock for months. Inside that device was a display technology called e-ink, a thin, flexible, reflective surface that looked almost exactly like ink printed on real paper. It consumed almost no power when holding a static image. It was readable in direct sunlight. It was, in the judgment of millions of readers, the closest thing to a printed page that any electronic device had ever managed to produce. And inside a Xerox patent archive, filed on July 1, 1975, a document sat quietly. United States Patent Number 3892568. Title: Gyricon Material for Display Applications. Inventor: N.K. Sheridan. The drawings in that document show a thin, flexible sheet embedded with microscopic spheres. Each sphere is half white, half black. Under an electric field, those spheres rotate to show one color or the other, creating a display that looks exactly like ink on paper, requires almost no power to hold a static image, and is readable in direct sunlight. The patent was filed 32 years before the Kindle. The physics it described were, in every essential way, the same. This is Robert, and this is the Lost Patent Files. Today we're opening one of the most instructive cases in the history of innovation. How Xerox, the company that already famously failed to commercialize the personal computer, the graphical user interface, and the mouse, also invented electronic paper, patented it, built working prototypes, and then watched from the outside as another company brought the idea to a market that turned out to be worth billions of dollars. This is the story of the Gyricon, of Nick Sheridan, and of what records suggest is one of the longest gaps between invention and commercial consequence in the history of modern technology. To understand how this happened, you first need to understand where it started. Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, opened in 1970 with a mandate that was remarkable by any standard. Xerox, then the undisputed dominant force in document reproduction, wanted to invent the future of the office. They assembled some of the most creative computer scientists and engineers in the world, gave them generous budgets, and told them to build what the next generation of work would look like. What came out of PARC over the following decade reads like a checklist of modern computing: the graphical user interface, the mouse, Ethernet networking, laser printing, object-oriented programming. PARC invented them all, and in a pattern that researchers and business historians have documented extensively, commercialized almost none of them. Nick Sheridan arrived at PARC in the early 1970s as a display engineer. His assignment was practical and specific. The early workstations being built at PARC used cathode ray tube displays, the same heavy, fragile, power-hungry screens that lived inside televisions. For a desk machine, this was inconvenient. For anything portable, it was a dead end. CRT screens required continuous power just to hold a static image. They weighed several kilograms. They were completely unreadable in direct sunlight. If the future of computing was going to move beyond the desk, and the researchers at PARC believed it would, the CRT had to go. Sheridan began thinking about what a truly ideal reading display would need to look like. And he didn't start from the engineering side. He started from the human side. He asked, what is it about paper that makes it so good as a reading surface? Paper is reflective. It shows images by reflecting the light already in the room, rather than generating its own. That means it works in any lighting condition. Bright sun, dim lamp, it doesn't matter. Paper requires no power to hold its text. Once printed, a page stays readable indefinitely without consuming any electricity. Paper is thin, light, and flexible. And the one thing paper can't do is update its content. That, Sheridan reasoned, was the only advantage electronics had to add.
Here is the critical detail that makes this technology remarkable. When you remove the electric field, the spheres don't move. They stay in whatever position they were last driven to. The image is held in place mechanically by the viscosity of the surrounding oil. No power is required. The display only consumes electricity during the moment it changes, and then goes completely passive. Sheridan called this material the Gyricon, from the Greek word for turning. He filed the foundational patent application in 1973. The patent, number 3892568, was granted on July 1, 1975. Over the following 2 years, Sheridan and a small group of colleagues at PARC built prototype sheets. Early results were genuinely promising. The prototypes demonstrated exactly what the theory predicted. Text written with an electrical stylus stayed visible without any power being applied. The image could be erased by reversing the field and immediately rewritten. The surface was reflective and readable under room light in a way that no backlit display could match. In 1977, Sheridan published his findings in the Proceedings of the Society for Information Display, a detailed technical description of the Gyricon system that circulated among display researchers worldwide. The concept was proven. And then the first turning point arrived. And this is where the story of the Gyricon diverges from the story of a simple technological breakthrough into something more complicated and ultimately more instructive. The problem was manufacturing. Producing millions of bichromal spheres, each one precisely 100 microns in diameter, each one with a perfectly uniform white hemisphere and black hemisphere, each one with the correct electrical charge differential between its two halves, was, with the material science and production technology available in 1973 and 1977, and indeed for most of the following decade, extraordinarily difficult. The sphere fabrication process required consistent chemical conditions that were hard to maintain at scale. Batches varied. Sphere sizes were uneven. The resulting prototype sheets showed the concept clearly, but the image quality fluctuated. Some sheets showed excellent contrast. Others showed graininess and inconsistency that would have been unacceptable in any commercial product. The cost per sheet, once you accounted for the materials, the fabrication process, and the rejection rate from bad batches, was nowhere near anything a consumer or an enterprise customer could be expected to pay. Technical papers from this era and accounts gathered in subsequent histories of PARC indicate that internal estimates place the cost of a production-quality Gyricon sheet at levels that made commercialization, at 1970s scale and price, essentially impossible.
This was not a problem of ideas. It was a problem of chemistry and manufacturing, of supply chain, and it was a real constraint, not a convenient excuse. But here is where the second turning point, the institutional one, compounds the first. Xerox in the 1970s and 1980s was, by most accounts, a company whose entire strategic logic was organized around its copier business. The photocopier division was enormously profitable. When PARC produced a breakthrough, and PARC produced many, the question that records indicate repeatedly came back from management was, how does this connect to the copier? How does this help us sell more machines, or protect the machines we already sell? A flexible electronic display sheet didn't answer that question. It wasn't a faster copier. It wasn't a better copier drum. It didn't reduce toner costs. It lived in a different product category that Xerox didn't sell into, and didn't have a sales channel for, and didn't have a clear customer for within the existing business model.
Sheridan kept working, not with large teams or significant resource allocations, but persistently, year after year, through the 1980s and into the 90s. He refined the sphere fabrication process incrementally. He improved the oil formulation. He filed additional patents as the technology developed. He presented updated prototypes to Xerox management at intervals. By most accounts available in the research literature and in historical analyses of PARC, the response was consistently some version of the same message. The technology is interesting, but the company is not ready to invest in it at the scale required for commercialization. Not yet. Meanwhile, the world was shifting in ways that should, in retrospect, have made the Gyricon more urgent rather than less. The laptop computer arrived in the 1980s, creating a genuine market for portable displays. Digital publishing became a real concept in academic and technical circles. The idea of a handheld device for reading documents, books, and papers was beginning to circulate. None of these converging signals appear, based on available records, to have meaningfully changed Xerox's internal calculus about the Gyricon. Then, in 1997, the third turning point arrived, and this time it came from outside. At MIT's Media Lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a graduate student named Joseph Jacobson began working on what he called, in early presentations, the last book. Jacobson's approach was technically different from Sheridan's. Rather than using rotating bichromal spheres, Jacobson and his collaborators developed electrophoretic ink, microcapsules, each containing both white pigment particles with a positive charge and black pigment particles with a negative charge, suspended in a clear fluid. Apply an electric field, and the white particles rise to the surface while the black ones sink, or reverse it. The visual result was almost identical to what Sheridan had described 2 decades earlier, a thin, reflective, bistable display that looked like ink on paper and held its image without power. The key difference was manufacturability. Jacobson's microcapsule approach proved significantly more tractable with the material science of the late 1990s than Sheridan's sphere fabrication had been with the material science of the 1970s. The capsule production process was more compatible with standard industrial coating techniques. The consistency of the output was higher. Jacobson founded E-Ink Corporation in 1997, initially operating from the MIT Media Lab. Venture funding followed. Partnerships with established display manufacturers formed.
Within a few years, e-ink panels were appearing in prototype devices and beginning to move toward actual production. E-ink and the Gyricon were now in direct competition, one with 24 years of head start in the patent record, and one with decisive advantages in manufacturing readiness and institutional momentum. This was the format war that the display industry barely registered, because one side of it was still inside a corporate archive. And here comes the fourth turning point, the one that closes the story. In the year 2000, Xerox finally acted. The company spun out a separate entity called Gyricon LLC. Sheridan himself joined the spin-out. The small team filed additional patents, continued refining the sphere process, and targeted electronic shelf labels, the small price display tags in retail stores, as the initial commercial application. It was a reasonable strategy. The electronic shelf label market was real. The technology fit the application, and it didn't require immediate consumer-scale manufacturing.
But the timing, by any honest assessment, was catastrophic. E-Ink Corporation had a 3-year head start on Gyricon LLC as a commercial entity, and a significantly larger head start in terms of manufacturing partnerships and product pipeline. The display industry had already begun orienting around E-Ink's technology. Gyricon LLC was attempting to build a manufacturing operation essentially from scratch, competing against a company that had resolved most of the same production challenges years earlier. The spin-out demonstrated functional prototypes. It generated interest from potential customers. Technical reports from this period, including a Xerox document co-authored by Sheridan in 2001 and available through IEEE Explore, described the Gyricon system as a genuine competitor. But manufacturing scale and commercial partnerships never reached the threshold required for viability. In 2004, Gyricon LLC shut down. The spin-out had been in operation for 4 years. 3 years later, in November 2007, Amazon launched the Kindle. It used an e-ink display. It sold out in 5.5 hours. It was out of stock for months. The reading device that Nick Sheridan had described in patent 3892568 in 1973 was now, in a slightly different technical implementation, one of the most successful consumer electronics launches of the decade. What was actually lost here? Not just a commercial opportunity, as significant as that was. What was lost, records suggest, was approximately a decade of time. If Xerox had been able to translate the Gyricon into a commercial product by the mid-1990s, when laptop computing had made portable displays relevant, when digital documents were real, when the manufacturing challenges might have been solvable with focused investment, the trajectory of the e-reading market could have been fundamentally different. Instead, the technology sat in the archive long enough for a better-timed competitor to close the gap from behind. The legacy of the Gyricon is real, even if it's indirect. Sheridan's 1977 SID paper is cited in the foundational literature of electronic paper. The vocabulary he established: reflective bistable display, electronic paper, smart paper, shaped how the entire subsequent field described itself. And, in a turn that carries its own particular irony, the e-paper concept returned to disk media in the form of DVD-sized Gyricon demonstration sheets, years after e-ink had already won the format war. The physics Sheridan described in 1973 proved completely correct. What proved incorrect
was everything else. The institutional response, the timing of commercialization, the manufacturing investment that never arrived at the moment it was needed.
Today, the global e-paper display market encompasses e-readers, electronic shelf labels, architectural display surfaces, and emerging flexible screen applications. Its total value is measured in billions of dollars annually and is continuing to grow. All of it traces a lineage that runs, at least in part, through the work Nick Sheridan did in Palo Alto in 1973. And essentially none of the commercial value of that market accrued to Xerox or to the man who first described it. Nick Sheridan, in the interviews available in the public record, spoke about the outcome with a particular kind of measured equanimity. He noted that the electronic paper concept he had spent 30 years developing inside Xerox had indeed reached the market. He noted that it worked exactly as the physics predicted. The display was reflective, it was bistable, it was readable in direct sunlight. It held its image without power. Everything Patent 3892568 had described in 1975 had proven accurate. It had simply taken 3 decades and a different company to prove it to a paying customer. There is something worth sitting with in the image of that patent document. Filed in 1973, granted in 1975, sitting in an archive while the personal computer was invented and commercialized, while the laptop arrived, while the internet changed everything, while Amazon became a trillion-dollar company, while the Kindle sold out in 5.5 hours. The document wasn't wrong. The inventor wasn't wrong. The physics were never wrong. What failed was the translation. The gap between a working idea and a product that reaches the world. And that gap, when it's measured in decades rather than years, is the most expensive gap in all of innovation. If this kind of story is what keeps you here, the gap between invention and consequence, the technologies that worked but disappeared, the patents that described the future before anyone was ready to build it, make sure you're subscribed to the Lost Patent Files. These cases are everywhere in the archive, waiting to be opened. Leave a comment below with the forgotten technology you'd most want us to investigate next. And if this episode was worth your time, a like helps more people find these lost chapters. The next file is already open.